Hey everyone! Today I'm going to be talking to you guys about the development of gender identity. And this is chapter 38 in the Journal of Counseling and Development. So this article describes the interactions of giftedness with gender identity, gender role, and gender relations. I chose this topic because it was one I was least familiar with and it was something that I wanted to learn more about. The target audience for this article seems to be aimed towards counselors, though I feel like anyone who works with gifted students or students in general would benefit from this read. I would absolutely recommend this to anyone who's unfamiliar with this topic. In the beginning of this article, the author explains a few terms and how they are defined for the sake of this article. I think it's important that we know these definitions because some of them are often misused. So here are the key terms that I'm talking about in the article. The first one is giftedness, and they define it as one's potential for exceptional achievement or eminence in a domain. Number 2 is sexual orientation, which refers to the direction of one's sexual attraction. Number 3 is gender identity, the subjective sense of one's maleness or femaleness. Number 4 was gender role, the expectations of a society about the proper behavior for males and females. And number 5 was gender relations, the attitudes and behaviors of males and females in relationships with one another. Now, one of the most important key terms and one of the ones that's covered the most throughout this article seems to be gender identity, which is the subjective sense of one's maleness or femaleness. Now, the author explains thoroughly what gender identity is and how gender identity changes as we get older. For example, toddlers have a very fluid gender identity, meaning that as boys and girls, that they really, gender identity doesn't really mean much to them. Early childhood, which is ages 4 to 7, boys and girls both strictly enforce gender roles. So this is when they start assuming that certain colors, certain clothes, or toys are what make them a boy or a girl. Then in later childhood, children mature and begin to understand that their biological sex is stable. So after the author talks about gender identity and kind of gives us a better understanding of it, they start to begin to talk about 4 major topics. And so they start with giftedness and gendered practices, gifted and lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender students, gender relations, and distance from privilege. And then they talk about the model of talent development and how we can use this model. So basically, I'm going to go through and summarize each of these, and then we'll conclude at the end of this presentation. The first one I'm going to talk about is giftedness and gendered practices. So the author kind of separates between what people typically think of girls and what people typically think of boys, and then they talk about commonalities between the two. So first, when he talks about girls, they say that they're typically early readers. They typically are admitted early into kindergarten, but policies are different depending on the state. And then among millennial girls, depression, anxiety, and eating disorders are more prevalent. But gifted girls are more capable of masking it. Gifted girls are not only more likely to enjoy boys' activities, but also may have an early awareness of sexism. Some things that we can identify boys with is that gifted boys often struggle with gender identity issues when they prefer creative activities because some people find that seems more feminine. They fear loving art, music, and drama may mean that they are not masculine enough. And then gifted boys may underachieve as a way of establishing masculinity within their peer group, which I have seen multiple times. Boys are more often held back in kindergarten, which we're going to talk about in a minute too. Another quote that was in the article that I found very interesting was it says, "There's some evidence that the millennial generation of adolescents and young adults regards gender identity and sexual orientation as much more fluid and changeable compared to earlier generations." I thought this was something to really think about and say, has it changed? So like I said before, I was going to go back and talk about how boys were often held back in kindergarten. So this is called kindergarten redshirting. And it's the practice of holding a child back an extra year before kindergarten. So some parents believe that they're giving their child this extra time and that they're going to be able to improve, but there's really no evidence of its benefits, and sometimes it can actually cause social problems later on. The next section they talk about is giftedness and LGBT. So LGBT students meet federal, professional, and cultural definitions of giftedness at approximately the same frequency as non-LGBT students. In 2009, a reported 260,000 LGBT students were considered gifted. This is limited to youth who are open about their sexual minority status, which kind of makes me think that it is way more than that. So LGBT students are also more likely to choose safe career paths rather than pursue areas that are better fit for their talents and abilities. So the author also talks about what it is like for a gifted LGBT student. So for gifted LGBT youth, being twice different is what they call it, can be a real struggle, and sometimes it leads to depression and isolation. And not only are students having to deal with the emotional toll of being gifted, but they also must deal with the stigma of their sexual orientation. So this is why it's really important for LGBT gifted students to find support in their community. Now, one of these supports is like the Gay Straight Alliance, and this can help students feel a lot less lonely. They actually provide support in creative writing, artistic abilities, and leadership skills. The next thing we're going to talk about is gender relations, and distance from privilege. So distance from privilege is how the gifted person perceives fitting in mainstream of the dominant culture's traditions, values, and practices. So they separated it into two categories: non-racial minorities, males, high SES, so socioeconomic status, city residents, and heterosexuals were in one column, and then racial minorities, females, low SES, rural residents, and non-heterosexuals were in the other column. So what they talked about was how basically it supports that these students internalize societal values of gender, sexual orientation, and other personal identity values. And it says that these students right here would be considered more privileged. So Noble, Subtonic, and Arnold's model of talent development was developed in 1999, and it was the only model created to specifically address gender and giftedness and distance from power or privilege. So this model can kind of provide us a set of guidelines for the provision of gender fair counseling, or in most of our cases teaching gifted boys and girls. So here are some conclusions that were drawn from the model. So the first one was there are milestones and danger zones related to giftedness and gender. It's important for us to be alert to the dangers of ignoring girls' early signs of giftedness and kindergarten redshirting for boys. Gender interacts with variables that predict achievement in gifted students. So for gifted girls, the resilience to sexualization is critical, and boys' refusal to underachieve is as well. The next one was that gifted students who diverge from heterosexual norms face difficulties. So this may require intervention to prevent bullying and boost self-esteem. And this is something to really think about. Giftedness has implications for health and the need for perfection. So eating disorders for girls and pressures to be athletic for boys. The last one was that understanding that there are many pathways to success and life satisfaction. Where a student may be lacking in one area, a strength in another can propel them forward. And I think this kind of relates to all gifted students. So now I have a couple of discussion questions that I want you to answer for me. The first one is, the article mentions there is some evidence that the millennial generation of adolescents and young adults regards gender identity and sexual orientation as much more fluid and changeable compared to earlier generations. Do you believe this is true, and why? Number 2 is when looking at the model of talent development and its relation to giftedness and gender identity, what do you think educators are struggling with? You can go back to the previous slide to kind of see what those different things are. And then how can we use this information to create a more welcoming classroom environment? Thanks so much for listening.